In 2017, hundreds of white nationalists descended on Charlottesville, Virginia to defend a monument to Robert E. Lee. Their arrival marked the beginning of 24 hours of violent clashes with counter-protesters. One person was killed. Others were beaten and bloodied.
After the unlawful assembly was declared, it was really very festive. It just felt like we'd won. That's when we heard this loud bang. One car got pushed into the intersection, another car got pushed in right behind it. It was just utter chaos.
It's hard to imagine that such a big moment happened in this little space. But that's common in America, right? These big moments happen in these small places.
Absolutely. And this is what, we learn, that all of these small spaces can set the stage for huge explosions.
The battle in Charlottesville seemed to be over a single statue, and it's a battle that's been repeated in cities across the country. But more than 1,500 monuments to the Confederacy remain, honoring those who fought and died to keep Black Americans, like my ancestors, in bondage. So I decided to travel the South to learn for myself just how deep the roots of this fight are buried. I went looking for understanding, for something that would make sense of this moment. Along the way, I visited monuments, those that aren't so easily removed, the artifacts, small enough for some to ignore, the landmarks, too large to take down, and the legacy that resides in our memory and in our blood, because the fight was always about more than just a statue. Beautiful morning in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I didn't want to take this journey alone, so I asked my friend, John Eligon, a reporter for the New York Times, to join me, to help me process what it all means. What's going on, man? How you feeling?
All right, but yeah.
Good to see you. Finally made it. For years, we've talked about race and history, how his people came to America by way of Trinidad and mine through the slave trade. It just seemed natural for him to join me. In 2017, the City Council of Fredericksburg took up the question of whether to remove a slave auction block that stands on a corner in the middle of downtown. We're about to see an auction block where people were sold. What's crazy when you look at the old advertisements?
Yeah. 7
strong Negroes for sale. But the idea that we're not just talking about just what we consider as manual labor.
Yeah.
We're talking about artisans, professionals.
Yeah. When my uncle was young, he took a picture on the slave block from a Caucasian who wanted him to take a picture. And for him, it was about getting the money because he paid him. And when my grandfather realized that he had stood on that block to have his picture taken, my grandfather whipped him and threw the money away. And he told him what that block was and why he was never to go on that block again. That story has been with us since we were little children. This says, not only did we not want you here, but we still don't want you here. The lone Black councilman pushed for a vote to remove the auction block. The 6 white members of the council said they voted to keep it in its place to educate future generations. I've heard you say that Fredericksburg may be the most historic city in America.
Indeed. Our history is our nation's history. If I walk down to City Hall, I walk by the home of Mary Washington. I walk by James Monroe's law office. I walk by the home my mother was born in.
You also walk by an auction block, right?
I do.
What does that mean in terms of the history? At some point you arrive at a place where humans were bought and sold by the people of this community.
That auction block is an artifact. The very fact that you can stand where somebody was treated as property and where families were separated is very moving. It's like what Germany did when they kept Dachau and Auschwitz and all. It was like, don't ever forget. You can't ever forget how horrible that was.
Councilman Chuck Fry proposed removing the block.
It was going on everywhere. So if you look at,
the auction block had been
on my mind for a long time since I was a kid. You know, I used to see people spit on it, and I saw a mock auction where folks did a mock auction. That rips your soul apart. My stance was always, okay, you know, I think it needs to go. It came down to a vote. With all due respect to the Fredericksburg City Council, it was a 6-1 vote.
Do you believe that there is a way to do the block in a respectful way and keep it there?
I can't change my view. What we can do is tell a story that's a more full, in-depth story.
When you walk by that, and you walk by with your children, and you walk by with your people, what is the message being sent?
There's a possibility your great-great-grandfather was sold here.
It seems like the fight over the auction block, as you've mentioned, it's what's in our history books. What it represents has a rippling effect that exists in the very fabric.
That's America.
Yeah.
That's just America.
The Black Barbershop has always been a place of community, where wisdom is passed and stories are traded. Today's no different. So what was it like growing up with that auction block right there on the corner?
It was like an embarrassment. I don't need to see that block to know what the past was.
It made you mad because I could say that could have been my great-grandma, my great-grandpa. You bring them in on a boat and then you sell them. How do you try to memorialize something like that?
It is totally unfair and unreal that people can actually sit there and say that, oh, well, we're just saving history. No, what you're doing is you're spitting in our faces. That's what you're doing.
Just across the river from downtown is the Chatham Plantation, where hundreds of slaves toiled for nearly a century. You imagine the conversations that happened here, the idea that your fear of being separated from your family, torture. But then the flip side is the fear that you could be sold at that auction block, right?
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine, like, from down there, you're looking up here, you're seeing this, nice big brick house, but you're not thinking that. You're not thinking, I want to go up. That's the house of horrors, right? That's like the haunted house.
When you're an enslaved person, the only thing on the horizon is servitude, or death, or the sun running away. When the Union Army arrived here, and for the white folks, it sent a chill down their spine, and it was terror. But thousands of black folks fled across this river to join the Union Army.
Yeah.
Could you imagine that moment? In Fairview, Kentucky, the birthplace of Jefferson Davis, the state is wrestling with telling a fuller story around these memorials, including a larger-than-life monument dedicated to the only president of the Confederacy. Oh, there it is. Look at that.
Yeah, we're seeing it.
My goodness.
That's a big obelisk.
That is huge. When you think about the conversation and debate, especially over the last year, what role do the monuments and artifacts that can't be torn down as easily as a statue, how do they factor into this debate when you're talking about an obelisk that's 351 feet tall?
That's where we're really moving into in the past few years is talking about the construction of Confederate memory in Kentucky, rooted specifically in this site. Who are the groups that are raising money to create these monuments that populate our landscape today? Start to promote it, start to sell it back to not only the South, but to the entire nation, and sort of retelling the history of the South and the Civil War, and recognizing that this memorial landscape that we encounter is not a product of the Civil War, and that its history comes much later. Its history is situated within a story of a Jim Crow South.
During the early 20th century, groups loyal to the Confederacy began promoting a revisionist spin on the Civil War. The so-called Lost Cause was about more than memorializing dead Confederates. It was about painting the North as an occupying force and the South as noble defenders of virtue, all while minimizing the role of slavery. Their influence would fuel generations of Southern segregationists and nostalgia for the Old South. The United Daughters of the Confederacy were especially prolific. Starting in the 1890s, they put up at least 700 memorials to the Confederacy. Symbols of the Confederacy aren't all copper and stone. For decades, descendants of veterans have connected to the past through Civil War reenactments. Jeff Stokes has been reliving this history for 25 years. He counts dozens of Confederate soldiers in his family tree. What are we looking at here, though? This is a beautiful shot.
This is Nightfire. This is a 6-pounder, model of 1841. My brother and I built this. We looked it over, and he said, yeah, I can make those. So that's where it started. We thought, why not? That was a hot day.
When you're out there and you're in your uniform and you see the flags, is there a connection to the past? Is that what hinges
Yeah, there is a connection to the past. If you're interested in history, it's 10 times better than reading about it in a book. So I guess it gives you a greater appreciation of your forebears and the suffering they went through.
Does that appreciation dampen at all for you by the fact that they were fighting for the cause for the states that were pro-slavery?
You got to get into the mind of the 19th century mind, or get into the 18th century mind. It's really hard to do. You have to do a lot of reading.
A library is full of reading about why people decided that it was worth fighting and dying to own people and sell people.
And again, that was
I don't know if that's
one of the topics at the time.
That's a big topic, though. That's a big topic.
It's pretty big.
That's a big topic.
Well, if you didn't own slaves, it's not such a big topic.
Do you think, does that for you factor in at all in how we should view these monuments in the present day, given the fact that there's a large population of Americans who those monuments represent their subhumanness, they're not being human?
So do we squash it? Do we rewrite history? If you don't have some type of proof, then a generation from now, you'll have people arguing it, and it may just vanish.
But considering that for a great number of people in this country, those things represent deep trauma and great violence against people.
But haven't we got beyond that?
How many people?
Yeah, well,
Right.
how many people
Have
living
we?
in America today were slaves? How many people living in America today own slaves? It's roughly zero. So we should have got beyond that.
But we don't have, I'll take myself for example, we don't have our last name, we don't have our religion, we don't have this tongue I'm speaking with is English.
This language is not my native language either.
Right. But you have great benefit.
Everybody in America has a benefit. It's the greatest country in the world.
But not everyone has a benefit from slavery, correct?
Everybody living in America today has a great benefit and great opportunity.
The people of African descent in this country, people who were descendants of slaves, what benefit did they get from slavery?
They're here.
What's amazing is you get such a sense of place. Like this could be any town, every town, USA, but you're kind of surrounded, inundated with mementos from a past, right? Including mementos and monuments to the Confederacy.
How do we grapple with that? How do we grapple the pretty and the nice with the ugly underbelly?
There's as much division as ever in some ways because history means different things to different people. There is a lack of consideration of how this might make us as Americans feel, as Black Americans feel. There seems to be this this lock on the idea that we can't do away with history.
Yeah.
Not history.
But you're not doing that's
But you're not telling the whole true history. For many, heritage lives in the bloodline. We reached out to the great-great-grandson of Jefferson Davis. He's trying to reclaim his family's legacy from those who see Davis as a hero of white supremacy. The night before our meeting, we slept in the Vicksburg home of Joseph Davis, Jefferson's brother and mentor.
You say you're a Davis descendant in Mississippi, and you better be ready. It brings responsibility. People are assuming you're going to be a Davis. Somebody asked me why I don't dress up like him.
Hayes Davis still holds on to artifacts from his great-great-grandfather, a book he signed, a letter he sent, a chair he sat in. Is there more resonance with something that you own than something in a public square somewhere?
To me, yes, absolutely, because it's handed down. This chair it has reverence to me. A Confederate monument or a statue, when those folks put that up, had reverence to them.
How do you balance or reconcile or wrestle with the dual narratives around Jefferson Davis? One that we've all heard is the first and only president of the Confederacy. On the other hand, there are 52 years of his life before the Civil War.
I don't know if I reconcile them as much as I try to bring them together to have a complete understanding. And when we put that 4 years of his life, which is 5% in total perspective, is it what it is that we want to remember, or do we want to have a complete understanding of the entire 81 years of his life?
But that 4 years, pretty big 4 years, right?
Pretty big 4 years because it was the most dramatic part of American history in a lot of respects. But he led that country as a position that he was appointed to, not one that he wanted.
If we're dealing in the facts that we do know about Jefferson Davis, which is that he supported the expansion of slavery even before the Civil War and before he became president of the Confederacy, he did believe that black people were inferior to white people. in your mind, does that tarnish his legacy at all?
What bothers me the most is exactly what you just said. The statements he made in reference to the slaves were his own feeling about their status. And I cannot say that I support that, but again, it's the lens of perspective of the time and the place that he lived in. It is not the most favorable aspect, but it is part of his character that we have to understand.
I have to wonder, are you welcomed in those groups that are so staunchly pro-Confederate that they don't want to see anything happen to any statues, they don't want any more plaques? Are you welcome in those spaces?
In the pro-Confederate folks, I would say that I'm probably not.
Before leaving town, we hear there's one more stop we should make if we really want to understand what keeps so many Southern whites rooted to the Confederacy. First, would you mind saying and spelling your first and last name for us?
My first name, Gordon, Gordon. My last name, Cotton, Cotton, just like you pick.
There we go. So all this fuss over the Confederate statues and the flag and slavery, is it time for us to move forward?
No, if we're going to move forward on this, we're going to leave everything else out in our history. Are we going to be selective in what we're going to keep and what we're going to forget?
What about this idea, though, that these men were fighting to maintain that system of slavery?
That wasn't all they were fighting for. They were fighting because our homes were invaded. The whole thing was based on money. Most things are.
Going back to what happened in Charlottesville, someone was killed, someone was shot at, someone else was beaten up. Does it surprise you when you see that people are that virulent about their support and defense of Robert E. Lee and the rest?
Well, they're not the ones that started it. Defending it, yes, I can understand that, but they're not the ones that started it. Had the people not wanted to tear down a beautiful monument, it wouldn't have happened.
Perhaps they should be moved to somewhere where they can be respected, not in a place of public display where it's doing nothing but sending a certain kind of message.
I totally disagree with you. If it happened right here, we commemorate it here.
What do you think of Jefferson Davis?
He is my personal hero. I think he's one of the great men in American history.
What about, he was obviously someone who supported the expansion of slavery. Should that diminish or tarnish his legacy at all?
No, because he wasn't the only one. I think growing up in this community, 7 miles from Briarfield, going to a school named Jefferson Davis, they can destroy what they can, but they'll never destroy the legend of the man.
How much credence do you give to the idea of these are men of their time? What does that mean?
Certainly they were men of their time, but does that, exactly as I said, do we forgive them?
Having these conversations is kind of weird with some of the people who are able somehow to separate, advocating for slavery and, the inferiority of black people, and then say, but they were great guys who had a lot of accomplishments, right?
Yeah.
That's hard to square. Can you imagine this filled with people and tear gas, police on horseback, batons, people being beaten bloodied out here? Yeah. But you talk about history. Mm-hmm. Alabama has played such a crucial role of some of the most infamous periods of violence, right? But also of civil rights and progress. And so this place here plays like a dual role. It's significant on one side of history because of Edmund Pettus, who was famed as, a Confederate soldier and leader and Grand Dragon, but also we associate the Edmund Pettus Bridge with the fight for black civil rights.
Throughout this whole trip, we've heard people talking about history. You can't lose history. This is one of those cases where I think if someone says that, it kind of makes sense to me a little bit. I don't know.
In this old section of the cemetery, many notable citizens of Selma were laid to rest, such as General William Hardee, Senator Edmund Winston Pettus, and Congressman Benjamin Sterling Turner.
Here's our guy again, Jefferson Davis.
Yep.
That's gonna be for Nathan Bedford Forrest right here. Grand Master of the Klan. This monument was erected and dedicated October 7th, 2000. Listen to the way they describe this man. This monument stands as a testament of our perpetual devotion and respect. One of the South's finest heroes.
Then you look here, like they were judged by their skill, their price, their complexion.
The United Daughters of the Confederacy. They were a very active group. Look at this, the knightliest of the knightly race, who sing of the day of old.
Who's the knightly race?
Not Africans. I'm assuming a deathless song of Southern chivalry. This is a story about Southern chivalry, standing up for their way of life and their people, their homes, their farms, their children, the generations to come. No, there's no tearing this thing down. This will loom here. This isn't some little town square. This is the State House of Alabama. This is the Capitol. Some memorials are easier to find than others. 20 miles from the Capitol, a plaque stands on the side of the highway. It marks the spot where Elmore Bowling was lynched and his body left in a ditch, just 100 yards from where his 5-year-old daughter, Josephine, waited for him to come home. When you're black in Alabama, you can't help but walk in the shadows of these huge Confederate monuments. But do you see a connection between the message being sent about white supremacy and what happened to your father?
Oh, very much so. One of the articles that described my father's death says, enraged whites jealous about the success of a black man. If you acquire more than they think you should, they gotta put you back in your place.
Enraged.
Enraged.
Josephine told us she paid for her father's marker herself after the state refused to allow her to place it on public land. When you think about what you missed in life from not having him.
My mom went from prosperity to poverty almost overnight. Sometimes I've wondered what my life could have been had he lived. What my life could have been.
Elmore Bowling's name was included among the thousands of lynching victims at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. The memorial's director, Brian Stevenson, hopes the collected names will help change the narrative of a country still grappling with how to tell its own story.
When I moved to Montgomery, this was a city that had 59 markers and monuments to the Confederacy, and you couldn't find the word slave or slavery anywhere.
How is that even possible?
It's because people have been very intentional about denying that part of our history. So this memorial, this site, is intended to be a very intentional response to our silence.
We talked to folks around the country about what the Confederacy stood for and the monuments. They say black people owned slaves too. There were white slaves.
There were many reasons beyond slavery for the Civil War.
These are all things that are designed to de-racialize what happened. And they are aberrations. And we've allowed that to happen because we were fighting these other struggles, right? And so this site is designed to help people understand that you can't ignore this any longer. So you see one county with one name, and then one county with two names, and then you see a county like this with over a dozen names.
Do you have any Dodge County, Georgia?
Yeah, we do.
My great-grandfather, they were tenant farmers in Dodge County, Georgia.
Yeah.
And apparently there was some issue with some white men
Yeah.
where they owed him money around
Yeah.
the end of the year.
Yeah.
Right, selling
Yes.
up.
Yes.
Sent his son, Cornelius, into town.
Yeah.
They shot him, put him on a horse, sent him back.
Yeah. Yeah.
When we have the death certificate, it says age 12,
Wow.
12, cause of death, gunshot wounds.
Yeah. People who engaged in these terror lynchings could have buried the bodies in the ground, could have tried to hide this violence, which is what you would have imagined people would do. They did the opposite. They were actually proud to engage in this kind of racial terror. That's why hanging was so common. The whole idea was to taunt and to terrorize and to torment African Americans. That's why you have to think about this as terrorism. There are thousands who get killed, but there are millions who are victimized. You know, 7 black people lynched in Screamer, Alabama in 1888 for drinking from a white man's well. Dozens in Louisiana because they were protesting their low wages.
Am I crazy for when I read these things? I'm scared because sometimes I feel like this could have been last week.
Oh, it could have been. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It just weighs on you.
And this idea there's so many more because
yeah.
I know from my family story what happened.
Oh, of course.
And he's not here.
Yeah, of course. There's so much more.
Some say these monuments are about heritage and heroes, but if anything, they're also reminders of America's unsettled war with itself. I started this journey looking for light and understanding, to examine what these monuments mean to those who honor them. But it was never really about the monuments, the large, looming stone facades, or the grotesque stumbling blocks, or what lives inside the men whose grip on history has been shaped by the myths they hold as truths. If anything, it was about a reckoning and a time of American terror. I'm not sure where we go from here, but the road through history is long and winding, with markers along the way.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.